my starting point for doing the kinds of studies I do is that people are by nature monochronic. That means they prefer to finish one task through to completion before starting something else. I know that's the way I am, that's the way most people are. But we are working and living in polychronic environments. That means we're in environments where we use multiple devices, we have multiple screens, we're working multiple applications. So there's this basic disconnect. And so we can ask a number of questions about this disconnect. For example, how fragmented is people's attention when they use digital media? And can we explain distractions with digital media? What factors might affect workplace mood? Now, there's a number of challenges in trying to measure people's digital media use. We can do laboratory experiments, and laboratory experiments are great for creating an abstract model of the world. But it's really hard, especially if you're measuring workplace. It's very hard to measure things like career trajectories and stress and effects of personal life and so on. We can do ethnographic studies where you go into a workplace and you observe people, you shadow them. This provides very rich data, and it answers the why and how of people do what they're doing. But it doesn't scale very well. It's very labor intensive. If any of you have ever done ethnography, you know that. We can get people to self-report how much computer usage they have, but we also know from studies that people are not very good estimators of time that they spend on digital media. In fact, their error rates are up to 30% off. So I think that if we really want to study how people are using digital media, we have to go to where people are. And so we have to create living laboratories. So we have to go where people are in their natural habitats in the course of their real world use of digital media. So how can we do this? So we're very lucky that we're in an age where there's a revolution in the development of sensor technology. And people are using all kinds of devices to self-track, to monitor steps and sleep, and so on. And so, as I see the grand challenge for understanding digital media use, it's to see if we can automatically and unobtrusively capture people's behavior with the use of a range of sensors and other methods to be able to develop the kinds of insights that we might gain from ethnographic research. Can we do that in the same way? And so I have different projects that I work on that tries to address this problem. The Health Sense project is done with information workers in a workplace. This has been ongoing for a number of years. I've looked at college students in college life. Two very new projects that are just starting are the Tesserae project, where we're seeing if we can predict workplace performance, things like burnout and stress, through the use of a range of different kinds of sensors. And then stress in the workplace is a project to see if we can mitigate workplace stress, because that's a major health hazard for people, especially in Western countries. So in our work, we use a range of different kinds of measures, and I'm just going to quickly go through some of these. We've measured stress through the use of heart rate monitors that provide a measure called heart rate variability. We've used EDA sensors, electrodermal activity sensors. We're now beginning to use pressure-sensitive keyboards in mice because these are unobtrusive. This is what people use in the natural course of their work. We measure mood and focus. We've used experience sampling. We're now starting to use webcam software, which can very accurately detect mood through use of features, can also detect cognitive load. We've measured face-to-face interaction through the use of sense cams. These are small cameras that people wear around their neck that take continual photos, and then you apply face detection software, which very accurately can detect the presence or absence of an image in the photo. We log people's computer and phone activity. We've used actigraphs. These are like Fitbits to measure steps and sleep. And then we use a range of demographic and personality measures which act as ground truth. So these are personality surveys and surveys to measure stress and depression. Now, this conference is about trust. And so I wanted to say something about trust with this kind of data. We are capturing very large-scale data sets. So we're capturing measures by the second from very heterogeneous sources. This is very detailed information. It's very comprehensive about people, and it's very sensitive. So, we're collecting information like stress. We're collecting what applications people are using. We're collecting health measures. And so this is a serious issue for us to try to gain the trust of users, right, who are willing to participate and let us have access to this data. So this is, I don't have a good answer to this question of how to address user concerns, except to say we are very aware of this. Cynthia Dwork proposed an interesting solution called Differential Privacy, where users would specify the amount of risk that they're willing to accept when they contribute their data. So I wanted to start off by giving an example of what what your data can reveal about you. So if we just look at people's computer and phone use, and we just look at temporal features, we're not looking at content, we're not looking at any other information, but examples of temporal features are things like people's daily rate averages, how long they're on the phone or computer, the dispersion. Are you using it all at one compressed time period? Are you using it throughout the day? Device usage, things like the amount of usage during your waking hours, the amount of non-use, amount of social media usage, rhythm of usage. So are people using computers and phones in a regular routine kind of pattern or not, and time of day? So just looking at temporal features, we can predict people's personality features as measured by the big 5 traits with a significant amount of accuracy. So no content. There have been some really good studies that have found similar or slightly better accuracy mining sentiment of Facebook posts or looking at likes, what people like. This is simply temporal features. So now let's look at how fragmented is people's attention in the workplace. Okay, so if we just look at the duration of time that a computer screen is in focus on people's computer, and we make an assumption here, and the assumption is that it's a proxy for where people are paying their attention. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a pretty good measure. So in other words, if you click on email, we make the assumption that your attention is on that email application. And we find that the median duration of time for all computer usage for the participants who we measure, it's 40 seconds. So 40 seconds is not very long at all. That's the median duration of people's attention who are modern information workers. Now, there might be individual differences, and so we asked, can we find out whether there might be individual differences? So what we did is we looked at a whole series of variables that we thought might be associated with attention duration. And what we did was we ran a factor analysis, and we came up actually with 2 factors. We put those factors into a regression equation and tried to predict people's focus duration. And this particular factor came out as significant. This is a factor that we label lack of control. It's a referent label, and it's comprised of the variables, people who are high in neuroticism and people who score high in a personality trait of impulsivity, urgency, and people who are also very stressed. And this explains 19% of the variance of people's focus. Now, can we improve people's focus, right? So we discovered that people's attention duration is pretty short, right? Can we increase the length of time that information workers might focus? So what we did was we did a field experiment. We had 32 people, and they worked in a baseline condition, and we measured different aspects about them. And then for a week, we had them block all non-work-related distractions using commercial software that does this. And most of these non-work-related distractions were social media. Not all of them, but the vast majority were. And we used a cognitive absorption scale. So we hypothesized that there would be certain things that would be improved if people's non-work-related distractions were cut off. We hypothesized that their focus would increase, and indeed it did. We hypothesized that they would become less aware of time, but this actually was the opposite. Temporal dissociation is associated with this idea of flow, if you're familiar with it, where you're just not aware of the passage of time. People actually became more aware of time. We explain it because they didn't have distractions to get lost in. We found no difference in control, which was really surprising for us. That was the most surprising finding because we hypothesized that if your distractions were cut off, people would feel more in control of their work. And their enjoyment significantly decreased. So they didn't have social media to entertain themselves. So this control result was really a puzzle to us. And so we dug deeper into the data, and we looked at people's measure of control in the baseline condition, and we found there was actually a binomial distribution, that there were people who are very high in self-control, and some people are very low in self-control. People who are high in self-control also score significantly higher in the personality trait of conscientiousness and low in impulsivity. And it's the reverse. If you score low in self-control, you're also low in conscientiousness and high in impulsivity. Now, when we looked at workload, so what is people's cognitive workload when non-work-related distractions were cut off, we found a very interesting interaction. We found that people who are high in self-control, people who are high in conscientiousness, their cognitive workload actually increased when their distractions were blocked. But there was really no difference. There was a slight decrease for people who are low in control. So people who are low in control benefited a little. But why in the world would people who are high in control, why would it increase their workload? Here's why. We did interviews, and it turns out that these people just didn't take breaks. They were conscientious people. They didn't have online distractions where they could take a quick break. They worked straight through, so they didn't take physical breaks. There was everyone in general assessed themselves as being more productive. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about interruptions. There's a lot of work in the horror of interruptions, but there's actually two kinds of interruptions. There's interruptions that come from an external source, so things like notifications, colleague coming into your office, telephone call. There's also interruptions that are imposed. And what that means is if you're watching someone, you're observing them, completely of their own volition, they stop working on a Word document and they turn and they check email or check Facebook or pick up a phone. So we call these self-interruptions. So we took our data and we divided it into 1 hour blocks. And we measured the amount of external interruptions and the amount of internal interruptions in each of these blocks. And we found something pretty interesting. We found that when there were periods of high external interruptions and then they waned, what happened was that internal or self-interruptions kicked in and rose, right? So if you're not getting external interruptions, right, if they wane or if they stop, what happens is people start self-interrupting more. And the way I interpret this is that people have become conditioned to have very short attention durations. And if you're not getting interrupted by some external source, you interrupt yourself because people have gotten into a mode of being interrupted. Let's talk about rhythms of attention, so how attention is distributed throughout the day. And this was measured through experience sampling. So people would get a probe like this on their computer screen, and this top part is Russell's circumplex model, which measures arousal and valence. It's a measure of mood. But the questions that we're going to talk about next are people were asked, how engaged were you in the thing you were just doing, and how challenged were you in the thing you were just doing? People, they received these probes 18 times a day, and the irony is not lost on me that we're interrupting people this often. But it was great data, and it took them maybe 5 seconds to answer this. So we came up with this theoretical framework based on the challenge and engagement dimensions. And we came up with the idea that if people are highly challenged and they're really engaged in their work, we call this a state of focus. If people are highly engaged, but they're not at all challenged, we call that rote. You're doing rote work, mechanical, mindless kind of work. It's like playing solitaire, right? You're engaged, but it's not at all challenging. People who are not challenged, not engaged, we call it bored. People who are highly challenged and not engaged, we call that frustrated. We hardly got any any responses in the frustrated quadrant. These are just reference, right? Now, if you look into the literature, you see a lot of studies that associate focused attention with positive affect or positive valence. And whether these are called by different names, cognitive absorption, cognitive engagement, flow. But we also see consistently that when people are in a state of boredom, it's associated with negative affect. And so here's what we found. We found that people were happiest when they were doing rote work. So these other studies that found this association with attention and positive valence, right, they didn't unpack that engagement could involve high challenge or low challenge. But if you unpack it, you see people are actually happiest when they're doing rote work. Why? Because when people are focused, it involves some amount of stress, right? It's some amount of workload. Now, if we look at how attention is distributed over the day in the workplace, the black line represents people's focus of attention. There's two things that I want to point out that I think are interesting. The first, there are two peaks of attention that we see. One is about 11 a.m., about mid-morning. The other peak is roughly about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But what I think is more interesting is that people don't come to work, ramped up and ready to be engaged in their work. It takes them time to get involved. What do? They're checking Facebook, they're talking with colleagues. So, they need to ease into work. And so we're doing some current work to see if we can increase the rate at which people engage when they come into the workplace. I don't know if that's a desirable thing. Okay.
Can I just throw in the scary part is the boredom curve, how high the boredom is.
Yes.
We've been doing some work in schools, and 75% of kids say that their lessons are boring.
Okay.
And that's a huge...
Yeah, we can continue this after I get through because I see they're putting up the signs here. How can we explain distraction? Okay, so, there's a common idea that people are just really distracted and they surf on the internet and then they get bored. But what if the direction of causality is reversed? What if people are first bored, which makes them susceptible to being distracted? And so what we did is we looked at the three most common types of workplace communications that were in this particular workplace, which was face-to-face, email, and Facebook. And here's the basic way that the study was designed. So people were getting these experience sampling probes, and we looked at how long they spent on Facebook, face-to-face, and email after the probe. Of course, we had to put a control in because maybe people were using Facebook prior to the probe. So we controlled for the amount of time that they spent and the activity that they were doing. And here's what we found, that after people were doing rote work as measured by the experience sampling probe, they spent significantly longer on Facebook. When they were doing rote work or were bored, in a state of boredom, they spent significantly longer face-to-face interaction. But when they were focused, they worked significantly longer in email. Now, this led us to develop this hypothesis that it's really the particular attentional state that a person has that makes them susceptible to a particular kind of distraction. We looked at workplace mood. Workplace mood is really important because the mood people have during the day has carryover effects, right, to when they go home to their personal lives. We found the following factors were associated with workplace mood: shorter sleep the night before, difficulty in concentrating, email duration. I could say a whole lot more about email, and workplace productivity. Contrary to what a lot of other studies have found, they say that moving around the workplace is associated with positive mood, and these are based on self-reports. But using Fitbits, where we're actually measuring steps, we find no significant relationship, and we controlled for job demands, job decision, latitude, age, gender, and this explains 48% of workplace mood, which, yeah, for social science is pretty good. I want to emphasize that this is simply correlation, right? There's no causality here, and there could in fact be a cycle that if you're in a bad mood, it leads you to have shorter sleep. I wanted to say a little bit more about mood, and we were wondering what makes people happier in the workplace if they have interactions face-to-face or if they have interactions online, which happens to be Facebook in this workplace. So I want to ask all of you, we do a survey, at the time that these interactions occur, how many of you think face-to-face makes people happier, and how much of you think Facebook makes you happier at the time they occur? How many of you think face-to-face? How many of you think Facebook? Okay, the answer is face-to-face. Now, if we look at the end of the day and we look at people's mood at the end of the day, and we look at how much time they spend in face-to-face interactions, how much time they spend in Facebook, which do you think people are happier? How many of you think more time on face-to-face? How many of you think more time on Facebook? How many of you don't know? Mostly, it's Facebook. So why would that be? Well, we dug into the data, and it turns out that when people are highly engaged in their work, that's when they're spending time on Facebook. And if you're really engaged in your work, the last thing you want to do is have a face-to-face interaction, right? Because if you have a face-to-face interaction, you're a prisoner of that interaction, right? You have greeting rituals and the interaction and parting rituals, and you just can't break away very fast. But Facebook, you can go in and out as you please. You can take breaks when you want. So we call this grazing behavior. So what we're seeing is we're seeing changing cultural norms in dealing with digital information. I've been doing this for some years. I am seeing that the duration of attention seems to be declining. We do need to be really cognizant of the concerns with the privacy and security of this kind of large-scale data. People are starting to collect more and more data sets like this, and companies have been surveilling employees for a very long time. People have fragmented attention in the workplace. People are distracted, and we seem to be sanctioning speed. This is in other studies that I didn't talk about today, but the idea that there's an expectation that with email especially, people will respond fast. So there are opportunities for designing work with this data. First of all, individual differences exist. That's really important. It's not one size fits all. It's not that everyone is distracted or everyone has short durations, but there really are individual differences. We can think about how we might balance rote and focused work throughout the workday, right? Because there could be some optimal arrangement, or scheduling work based on attention patterns. So what might be the right time to schedule a meeting when people are, have focused attention, or maybe when they're bored? Thinking about how we might increase engagement earlier at the start of the day. And we're working also on interventions where especially we might reduce stress, increase focus, and make people happier in the workplace. So this is in collaboration with a number of really great colleagues who I need to give credit to and would like to thank our companies and participants. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Gloria, can you say something about telework?
We did not look at telework, and I wish we did, right? We didn't look at telework. Anyone else? Yeah.
Doesn't seem to work. I have a question about that graph you showed with the rote versus focus. And like the literature in positive psychology, specifically in regards to flow, would think that focus with high challenge, high engagement would be the best. And I know you mentioned it a little bit, but could you touch on that a little more of why the effect was so strong for the rote type of work?
It's because when people are focused, they tend to be stressed. And so if you're stressed, you're not particularly happy, right? It also turns out that when people are doing email, they're also focused. And one of the most consistent findings over and over again is that email just puts people in a bad mood. Email is symbolic of work, and people, they really have negative feelings about email. And email comprises a really big part of the day. So there are several reasons. Yes?
So just to follow up on that, I think there's maybe a third category of focused, and then there's another level, which would be flow, which is that kind of optimal challenge. I don't know that maybe that captures the experience of flow in that particular study. But my question was kind of drilling down into when people take breaks. So I know as an academic, right, it's when we're stuck. Like there's an idea, or there's the wording we're trying to capture, and we know that we can't proceed. So then we switch. At least I can be productive and answer my grandma's message. Right. So I'm just wondering whether it's the desire to take a break, or it's just getting stuck in your workflow that's leading to the break. So I'm not sure whether we want to call it distractions or as a.
So I don't want to say that taking breaks is negative. Taking breaks are really important, right? They serve to refresh people. But people can also take breaks in the wrong way, and many of our participants report just getting stuck on social media, They talk about rabbit holes, they can't get out. So there's a distinction between taking break to incubate a problem so that you get a new idea, you refresh, you rejuvenate your resources. That's really important. But as opposed to just being distracted and then before you know it, half hour has gone by, which is not uncommon. Yes?
My question relates to the issue of distraction and interruptions. And in some of our work, what we found is that distractions can sometimes be very helpful in facilitating particularly simple tasks, rote tasks, and the like. And so that's one finding. In terms of interruptions, in some cases, if somebody can predict when they might get interrupted, they actually work harder before that interruption occurs.
Yeah.
And so those are two of the kinds of issues. And the last one is, of course, distractions. That task context is an important one because if they're doing something complex or the least bit taxing, they're likely to do more poorly. And so that becomes an issue. And so I think that breaking those kinds of things apart can sometimes be very helpful. And then in just one last comment, and that is when we put music into the workplace, we find some really fascinating results, but individual differences play a major role in what does get and is an intervening variable into the picture of how people then wind up doing both on their mood and their tasks.
Yeah. So some time ago, we did a study. It was a laboratory study where we induced interruptions. And we had people doing an email task. And we found that when people were interrupted, there was no difference in accuracy of results or politeness. And we looked at a bunch of other measures. But people worked significantly faster and became significantly more stressed. And so the way I interpret that is that if you're in an environment where you anticipate interruptions are coming, and you know there's a finite amount of time in the workday, you're going to speed up your work to finish the task right before the end of the day. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying. And I totally agree with you that interruptions, breaks, distractions can have value, right? We just have to think about the right balance. Yeah.
Gloria, do you have any insights or have you done any research around the effects of open plan offices on people's performances? Is there heterogeneity there, or?
Yeah.
Just curious.
So we did look at our data with people who were working in cubicles versus offices. We did not have an open office plan. So people who work in cubicles are significantly more interrupted, but they're interrupted more with peripheral interruption. In other words, they're interrupted by content that does not have to do with their work, right? If some colleague is asking advice or solve this bug or whatever, whereas in an office, of course, you're getting interrupted more from remote kinds of communication like telephone calls.